have a seat. Now we'll turn to the Gospel of Acts. Gospel of Acts, the book of Acts, Acts 21. We've been looking through this book, and we come on to a question or an example of persecution. Just wondering if we could turn down the fan a wee bit, if that's possible, Terry. Let's go to Acts 21 and verse 27. But let me ask, first of all, just about persecution. Like, everyone claims to be a victim. I don't know, there's a very good Australian comedian who does this skit about students in a school and how they don't get marked according to how they do in the exams, but they get marked according to how many victim points they can get. And it's hilarious and also quite sad. But everyone claims to be a victim, and I think sometimes as Christians we can claim victim status as well. Or let me put it another way: is there real equality and diversity in Australia? Are Christians being persecuted, or do we just need to man up and stop whining, or woman up and stop whining? I don't know if that's a right expression. Now, in the book of Acts, we notice something really interesting, that there were a lot of riots. In Acts chapter 10, in Acts 17, verse 6, it says, "These men who've caused trouble all over the world have now come here also." So Christianity caused a great deal of trouble. I do not want, under any circumstances, I do not want people marching along Tudor Street protesting against the church. You may think that's a crazy scenario. I know that when I was back in Scotland, my elders and we held a meeting to discuss what we would do when protesters came in. It was really quite an interesting scenario. I said, well, I'll just preach them the gospel. And that's one way of getting people into the church, but they weren't too keen on the idea. What would you do? I mean, when did Christianity last cause riots? And should we expect persecution or prejudice or discrimination? So Paul writes to Timothy and says, anyone who wants to live a godly life will suffer persecution. And Jesus says, very interesting, Jesus says, because they've hated me, they're going to hate you as well. Now, you think that doesn't make sense, because you think, well, people like Jesus, they don't like the church. You know, Jesus is a good guy. And everyone claims Jesus on their side. He's a good guy. But Jesus says, because they've hated me, they're also going to hate you. Sometimes you hear people say, if only you were more Christ-like in the church, then you wouldn't be so unpopular. It's not the way that Jesus sees it. So let's look at this and maybe see what's involved. Maybe I'll say another thing, why we should expect persecution. To some degree, it's because you're different. I remember when I first went to secondary school, and we'd just moved up from England to the Highlands of Scotland, and I had an English accent. Within a week, I had a broad Scottish accent, right? Why would you do that? Because I just wanted to fit in. I hadn't listened to any pop or rock music at all. Within a week, I knew everything about the Beatles. You know, why would you do that? Because you want to fit in. You really, really don't want to be seen to be different. You know, it's a bit like, can I suggest this? If you wanted to be really radical, go to the Glastonbury Festival with an Israeli flag and see how long you last. You know, that would be different. You know, you're being different. And one of the reasons that Christians will end up getting in trouble, very often anyway, is because we are different. And then another is, and this doesn't make a lot of sense to many people, is because we're holy. Now, holy depends on the background that you have, but holy carries the idea of maybe a hypocrite. Robert Burns' Holy Willie's Prayer. It's a very famous poem in which he mocks an elder in the church who's a hypocrite. And so but we think of holiness like that. But holiness is something different. Holiness implies the idea of beauty, and it implies the idea of being separate for God. That's tied in with the difference. And then there's another way of putting this. You're kind of like lights in the darkness. John tells us that men hated Jesus because their deeds were evil. And if Christians don't go along with, let's say, what is the culture in their office or the culture in their school, then maybe people won't like that. I've seen this in so many different ways. I'll just give you one example. I'll give you a couple as we go through this. But I remember I was sitting with a cafe with a guy who was a youth worker, and he was just asking for help. And he and I were just talking, and, we weren't talking very loudly. Just a normal cafe, and we were sitting chatting, and then this man came up to us. He paid his bill, and then he came up to us, and he slammed his fist down on our table and said, "I hate you people. I hate you Christians. You're all," and then he swore a few things and then stomped out. I thought, what do we do? And everyone else is looking absolutely shocked, staring at us. What were we? For me, it was quite an astonishing thing. Because we weren't talking about sinners and, how terrible everyone was and stuff. We were just talking about, how do we run a youth club in the church? And this guy was just so angry. Why? Well, let's look at this. So, let's go to verse 27, stirring up the mob. When the 7 days were nearly over, this is at the end of a festival, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. Paul, just to keep you up to scratch, has returned to Jerusalem. He's collected money from churches in Turkey and in Greece to give to the poor in Jerusalem. So they saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the city. Now, there's some basic principles here. As we look at this, what happened in Damascus, in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, there are principles that still apply to us today. First of all, it's a false accusation. That's really important to grasp. Paul was not teaching against the law and not against his own people. And ironically, he was in the temple because he was undergoing a Jewish purification rite because the church in Jerusalem had asked him to, and he kind of compromised and went along with that. And there's an irony here as well. 25 years before, maybe 30 years before, Paul had been a witness at a trial of another man called Stephen, who was accused of exactly the same thing. He's defiled the temple. And Paul stood there and applauded while Stephen was stoned to death, and then went out to persecute other Christians. And he was Saul then, and he was converted, and he became Paul. But the irony of Paul facing the same false accusation that started his journey to the Christian faith is ironic. Christianity was not opposed to the temple or to the law. It was the fulfillment of them both. So it was a false accusation. And then the second accusation was just a straight lie. They accused him of bringing a Greek into the inner temple, where Gentiles were not allowed. And that's because they'd seen this man called Trophimus, who had come from what was then called Asia and is now called Turkey. Now, in 1935, someone discovered, and this has been proved to be genuine, a sign that was placed in the old temple. And it said this: "No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught doing so will have to blame himself for his ensuing death." There was a wall that divided the Gentiles and others. Now, I'm trying to think, how could I illustrate this? This is not a very good illustration, but imagine if we put a barrier across here and said, only Scottish people are allowed up here. And on pain of death, anyone who's English or Australian or whatever, you're dead if you cross that barrier. That seems a ridiculous example, but that's really what was being said. And the Romans were so concerned about this that they said to the Jewish authorities, you've got the right to kill someone if they do that. Those of you who know your Bibles will know in Ephesians, Paul talks about the dividing wall of partition. That's what it was. He's referring to this, and he's saying that Jesus broke it down. Ephesians 2, verse 14. But Paul hadn't taken Trophimus into the inner temple. He knew that that would have been a provocation, and he didn't do so. The dividing wall that's broken down is not really this wall in the temple, because 7 years later, that temple is going to be completely destroyed forever. But it's the dividing wall between races, between Jew and Gentile, that he's speaking of. But it was just a lie. They told a lie about him. And then the next thing is that the crowd, or the mob I would call it, is characterized as ignorant and full of false accusations. And I think that whilst there are many things that the church can be accused of, I think we are often, as collectively and as individuals, accused of things that are false, but people believe. So I've lost count of the number of times that people assume that because I'm a member of the clergy, that I'm a pedophile. And you think that's ridiculous. Well, yeah, it is and it isn't, because there was so much abuse that occurred, particularly in this area in the churches, that people look and say, and I've had people shout at me on the street because of that. And in one way you understand it, in another way it's just not fair. It's just wrong. But there are other things as well. My first charge, I was a young man. I was 24 years old in a Highland village. And I remember hearing rumors. Small villages are great, right? Except everyone knows your business. And what they don't know, they make up. So by the time I was 2 months into my charge, I was in the middle of my 6th affair, and then there's one guy, I heard one guy say to his mate, hey, you better not let your wife go to that church because that's the man who drives women crazy. And I thought, what? And then they went even further. They were going like, oh, that's the church for menopausal women. I was going, oh my goodness, where's all this stuff come from? Because people, what you don't understand, you want to justify disliking, and so you far too easily believe things. Now that happens across races. That's why you should never stereotype a whole race in that way. They're Scottish, they're mean. They're Irish, they're not very smart. They're Chinese, they gamble. They're Australian, they're just rude. None of these stereotypes are true, but people make them up, and they do the same in terms of the church. So I think that it is... I mentioned the book of Psalms. It's only when I started getting a lot of abuse that as I read through the Psalms, I realized that a huge amount of the Psalms are about being falsely accused and being slandered. And it's a horrible thing. Do you ever get taught that thing, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me? Absolute rubbish. I much preferred getting beaten up to being slandered. And what do you do when you've got rumor and when there's truth twisting and so on? I've mentioned this before, but I always find it quite interesting if I go to a place and someone comes up afterward and says, you're not nearly as evil as they said you were. Well, what did they say I was? Am I some kind of axe murderer or what? Where did you get all this stuff from? And that's what people do. Well, what do you do when you're falsely accused? The only thing we can do is rely on the fact that God knows the truth. Do I think as long as you've got your integrity. So I was speaking to somebody, not a Christian, and I so admired them. This was an evidence of common grace, because they were talking about a situation at work, and they said, I couldn't do it because it would have been a lie. And they may lose their job. But I thought, that's integrity. And that's what we want. And as Christians, when we're accused of things, we need to look and say, well, is there any truth in that? Have I given that impression? What's wrong? And then we have to rely on the fact that God knows the truth. So, what happens? Get rid of him. The whole city was aroused and the people came running from all directions. Crowd attracts a crowd. You must know that. You must know that two people fighting on the street is going to attract a crowd. Two people hugging one another isn't really. Fight works in that sense of getting attention. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he'd done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him! Get rid of him!" They were abusing Paul and they were beating him. And they certainly would have killed him. There's something interesting here, by the way. They didn't want to kill him in the inner court, so they dragged him outside, where ironically he was rescued by the Romans. Now, the Romans had a garrison of around 1,000 men who stayed in a fortress called the Fortress Antonia, just outside Jerusalem, because to have it inside Jerusalem would have been too provocative. We know from chapter 23, verse 26, that the commander referred to here was a man called Claudius Lysias. And I think there's another principle here. God sometimes uses the secular authorities to protect his people, even when those secular authorities do not acknowledge him. I think that's an important principle. It's also interesting that the same word that's used for the mob seizing Paul in verse 30 and the commander arresting him in verse 33, it is the same word. The difference is the Jewish mob wanted to kill Paul and the Romans wanted to protect him. So they arrested him. I'm reminded there's a case in the UK just now of a Turkish man who was trying to protest against the Turkish government. And somewhat foolishly, I think, he burnt a Quran outside the Turkish embassy. But then someone stabbed him and he was getting beaten up. And he was the one arrested, not the man who stabbed him. I think, hang on a minute, there's something wrong with this picture. But this is what happened with Paul. He was arrested for, I think, his own good. And he was bound with 2 chains, 1 soldier on each side of him. But what struck me here is the crowd in verse 36. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." Well, 30 years earlier, Luke 23, verse 18, the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man, release Barabbas to us." As we've been going through this latter section of Acts, we've been noticing the similarities between Jesus and Paul. And Jesus had said to Paul, "You must suffer many great things for my name." And he was going the same route that Christ did. And here is the mob that yelled for the death of Jesus, now yelling for his death. Now, I want you to notice something else as well in verse 30. It's just one of these little details that were really important. Immediately, the gates of the temple were shut. This is the last time in the book of Acts that the temple is mentioned. The temple is going to be destroyed. The people shut the gates. Jesus opened them. Our society talks about being open and diverse and tolerant and equal. I don't think it is. I think what it means by those words is the very opposite of what they really mean. But the church needs to be really careful that we don't react in kind and that we ourselves are open and, we accept people from all different backgrounds, even people who hate us. I remember one time I was looking at in church and there was a couple there. It was the president and secretary of the Atheist Society. And I thought, I just had a debate with them. And I thought, what are you guys doing here? And I spoke to them afterwards and they said, "Dave, don't tell anyone." So I can tell you now, because that was years ago. But I said, okay. I said, "But what are you doing here?" They said, "We just wanted to find out more." And I said, "Look," I said, "that's great. You're very, very welcome." And they said, "Listen, Dave, we're going to go away and basically, to preserve our reputations, we're going to go and slag you off, but we don't really mean it. We actually really enjoyed this. So I said, okay, fair enough, go ahead and slag me off. And I mean, I did welcome them because I wanted them to hear, and I actually admired their passion. I didn't like what they wrote about me, but it was just fascinating to see. And I think, we have to welcome. I cannot think of anyone I would not welcome into this church. Some of you may know we've had a couple of incidents recently with people being quite violent and abusive. If they came into the church again, I would welcome them. Not be violent and abusive. You're going away. You're going to do that, you're going back to jail. But you come in and you want to hear about Christ, then honestly, we don't care. We want everyone to know. Get rid of him, they said. And then verses 37 to 40. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's commission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were silent, he said to them in Aramaic. And actually, if you want to hear what he said to them, you'll have to come back next week. Or you could just read on. But what I noticed here was mistaken identity. He was thought to be an Egyptian terrorist. Now, who was this man? We know who this man was. We know he's described by Josephus, the Jewish historian, as an Egyptian false prophet who about 3 years previously had come with 30,000 men to the Mount of Olives and had said that when he commanded the walls of Jerusalem, they would fall down and they could go in and kill all the Romans. They had this great name. They were called the Sicarii. And the Sicarii literally means the dagger assassins. So these were like, you think of these Japanese ninja. I don't know if you've ever seen these films that they go around throwing daggers and just killing people just like that. Well, that's what these guys were supposed to be. And Luke says there were 4,000 of them. We think Luke is much more accurate than Josephus. Josephus had a tendency to exaggerate. But I find it interesting, the comparison. It turned out that this was false, and a number of his fanatical nationalist assassins were killed, although he himself escaped. So you can understand the thinking of the Roman centurion. He's thinking, here's this mob, here's this guy, maybe he is the Sicarii leader. Are you the terrorist? And Paul, the reason he's puzzled is this, because Paul spoke to him in Greek. And he was not expecting that. Greek was the language, the Roman would have thought Greek, Latin, as being civilized. Now, when Paul spoke to him, he spoke to him in educated Greek. And so there's this soldier thinking, I've got this thug who's a terrorist, and then he's going, hang on a minute, this is an educated Greek. Whoa, this is messing with his head. And then Paul says, I'm a citizen of no ordinary city. Now that referred to Tarsus, which was a cultured, educated city, and so on. And I was thinking of an illustration for this, and I realized whatever illustration I used, I'd get in trouble with somebody. So, it's like somebody going, oh, I'm a citizen of Sydney. Don't you realize that? I live in the North Shore. Why do you accuse me of being a peasant? It's a kind of idea that do you know where I'm from? Someone's saying that. And the soldier's just really, really puzzled. Who is this man? He's educated, he causes all this kind of trouble. It just makes him think. And I think people have an awful lot of prejudices about us, and we need to challenge those prejudices, sometimes not directly, but just by who we are and what we do. Paul was bridging a chasm between the kind of Judaic nationalism and the Roman authorities and the Greeks and so on. He's bridging a chasm between two worlds, and sometimes we have to do that. So again, I'm in a particular position where I'm seen as, I am a minister in the church. And I remember going to the northern pub across the road, and I met some boys, and they said, "Oh no, we're Catholic. We don't do that." I said, "Do you go to church?" They said, "No, we're lapsed Catholics." And I said, well, how about coming and trying being lapsed Protestants and see how that works for you? And we talked for a while, and they said, you're not really like we imagined a minister to be. And it confused them. I know it confused them. But I think it's not a bad idea to confuse people sometimes, to challenge people's prejudices in that way. Sometimes we judge in just such an awful way. I think of many times that I've looked at somebody and thought, well, maybe, and they've turned out to be very, very different from how they look. So, I put up a picture there of that woman there. You may or may not recognize her, Gladys Aylward, who was born in North London to a working class family and became a renowned Christian missionary in China. She struggled with the Chinese language, for which I have a great deal of sympathy. And so she wasn't accepted by China Inland Mission, so she just went herself. She funded her own journey via the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was some journey, to China in 1930, where she joined a missionary called Jeannie Lawson and ran an inn, and she shared the gospel. She became a Chinese citizen in 1936, and she worked as a foot inspector to end the practice of foot binding, which was a horrific practice that young girls were bound, their feet were bound, because it was to crush the bones to make their feet smaller, because small feet were considered more beautiful. And she worked with that. During the Japanese invasion, she became famous because she led over 100 orphans to safety. She was forced to leave China in 1949 due to the communist regime and settled in Taiwan in 1958, founded the Gladys Aylward Orphanage, and continued her missionary work until her death in 1970. She had a book called The Small Woman, and if you've ever seen the film, The Inn of the Sixth Happiness, that referred to her. The film, by the way, is rubbish. She hated it because it portrayed her as giving up her missionary work for love, and she never did. She continued to follow Christ all the time. But the reason I put her up there isn't it extraordinary? She's a wee woman. She's an extraordinary working class woman from the poorest area of London who took on the Japanese and the Chinese communist authorities, and actually the Taiwanese when she went to Taiwan. And she just won. Just by standing firm, just by showing courage, just by, just caring for people and looking after people. And I think I want to see a similarity. So how you deal with opposition. I'll explain who that lady is in a minute. I want you to know, again, the similarity with Jesus, that he was delivered to a mob, that the Romans could find nothing wrong with him, and yet they still let him be punished. I want you to notice that Paul spoke to the people in Aramaic, or Hebrew, and he also spoke Greek to the centurion. He was an ordinary Jew in one sense. He was not a terrorist and not a man of violence. He says that he's a citizen of no mean city, no ordinary city. There's a wonderful biography of somebody in Glasgow called No Mean City. Glasgow was famous for having lots of gangs and everything else. I don't know, like West Sydney or something. Or I was thinking of areas in Newcastle, but Whitebridge. No. But, he was a citizen of heaven. Now, that lady up there is a Victorian government minister who was being asked by an MP, under your new hate speech law, would the portrayals of Christ in a sexualized way at the Mardi Gras in Sydney be considered hate speech? And the minister was absolutely horrified and said, what are you doing? You're ridiculous. This is silly. You're making a mockery of my hate speech bill. And then she said this, unless he's come back to life. Jesus is not going to be at the Mardi Gras unless he's come back to life. And there are two things. One, he has come back to life. And two, you can mock dead people. And if you want to try that, I suggest you go to Victoria and see how long you last if you mocked Muhammad. You would go straight to jail under the hate speech law. So, but what got me about the lady was not the incoherence of her talk, but it was the biting contempt and sarcasm against Christians. And I thought, wow, where'd you get that from? Where'd such hatred come from? How do you deal with opposition? I would suggest this. We learn from Paul that you need extraordinary courage He was beaten and bruised. He was rescued from death. And this is the one that gets me. In fact, this is so extraordinary that there are some commentators who say this can't be true because this couldn't have happened. Nobody would do this. He stands up, having been almost beaten to death, and says, I want to talk to the crowd. That's courage. Derek Thomas also points out that Paul's incredibly calm here and not agitated. How could he do that? How could you not get agitated? It was the assurance in his mind that he was doing God's work. He was absolutely convinced of what he was called to do, and the concerns of the gospel came first. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, says Jesus. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. A Christian is not someone who's prepared to kill for Christ. A Christian is someone who's prepared to die for Christ. And that's a fundamental difference. We are just going to have a wedding in a moment. And a passage I'm going to read is from Ephesians. It talks about Jesus being the bridegroom and the church being the bride. Well, is it Tammy Wynette that says, stand by your man? I think when a Christian says, I'm going to stand by Jesus. Whatever happens, I'm going to stick with Jesus. That's the imagery that's used in Ephesians to talk about a husband and wife getting married. But for those of us who are Christians, you can't let the Lord down. Well, you can, but you don't want to. A man called Polycarp, 87 years old. He was being killed, 2nd century Roman Empire. And he was ordered to recant before he was put to the fire. And he said, I have served him 87 years, and he has never let me down yet. Why should I give up on him now? And what a testimony for us to be able to say, keep your integrity, follow Christ. How do you deal with opposition? You love your enemies. You stay strong and courageous. And you stay calm, because Christ has got this. He's in control. Lord, we ask your blessing on this word and pray that you would help us. In your name, amen.